Hey guys, it's Dave, and I'm here with this week's reading. This week, we're going to be reading Hebrews chapter 9, Psalm 84, Mark chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, and then these three verses which pretty much say the same thing. Matthew 27, 50 and 51, Mark 15, 37 and 38, and Luke 23, 45 and 46. So we're continuing on our journey looking at the temple. Last week we started, as we were reading Haggai, and just that call to go out and for the Jews to rebuild the temple. Those 50,000 Jews that had came out of exile of Babylon and came forth to rebuild the temple. Now we want to look at the temple. These readings right here are going to tell us a little bit more about the temple. And it's going to lead us into next week's reading, which is going to be about where the temple is today. And for a little clue, it's not in a building. So here's what we have. Psalm 84. As you read Psalm 84, it's a really cool psalm about someone who just wants to be in the presence of the Lord. Back in those days, the Jews were required to come to Jerusalem, to the temple 3 times a year for Passover, for Pentecost, and for the Feast of Tabernacles. And it looks like for some reason he couldn't make it to one of these times, and he was just longing for that presence of God, and just to be there. And we can relate in some degree because we do have those special places or those special times when we felt like we were closer, or those places that allow us to really get in and feel the presence of God. And that's what he's longing for. And it's a beautiful psalm with that. And we can relate a lot to it for anyone who just desires to be in the presence of God. But it brings up some interesting things about the temple and the temple veil, which we're going to read about in some other verses as well. So he was longing for the presence of God, and because there was a section in the temple called the Holy of Holies, which was separated by the temple veil. Tradition tells us that it was 60 foot high, approximately 30 feet wide, and some say even up to 4 inches thick of this veil that separated this place, the Holy of Holies. And the high priest would only enter this one time a year. And the high priest would enter just for that one time a year to bring the sacrifices for his people. And that's where the Shekinah glory, or the full-on glory of God was present, was in the Holy of Holies. Now, tradition tells us that at least in the last 2 centuries of the temple, that the high priest would have a scarlet cord attached to his leg or his ankle with bells on it, so that if for some reason the sacrifice wasn't acceptable, or the priest himself had not been ceremonially cleansed, and he would just die in the presence of God, and then that cord allowed them to pull his body out, because no one else was allowed to enter into the Holy of Holies except for the high priest that once a year. Now, I don't know if this is true, because Exodus, starting in chapter 28, going through 35, gives a specific dress code for the priests, and it doesn't mention a cord at all, so I don't know if that would have been allowed. But either way, regardless if it's true or not, it shows the degree of seriousness, and it shows the degree of just how incredible the presence of God is. And it really shows too just how incredibly distasteful sin is to God and to his presence as well. So just a little food for thought there. But yeah, you can read about the high priest going in his duties there in Exodus chapter 30, and then and if you want to read about the atonement of the sins for the people, you could read about that in Leviticus chapter 16 as well. Now, Hebrews chapter 9 is a cool chapter because This is sort of a chapter that bridges the old and the new. And Hebrews chapter 9 shows us that we no longer need that temple, that there is something greater than that temple in the person and the priesthood of Jesus Christ. And so read Hebrews chapter 9 and understand, looking at how the temple and how worship and sin was dealt with in the Old Testament, and what Jesus Christ has done for us today is a beautiful, amazing work, an amazing thing. Remember, before Jesus, sins could only be covered. Sinfulness could only be dealt with on the outside, and it was just a temporary covering. But Jesus can deal with sin inwardly. He can actually change the heart, our conscience. He can purify, and he's working to perfect us. It's so much better than what we had in the Old Testament, and that's what Hebrews 9 talks about. And look for these three quote-unquote appearances of Jesus Christ that we'll find here in Hebrews chapter 9. In verse 26, it talks about Jesus in the past, and it's talking about for our salvation. And it's that one work 2,000 years ago that he died on the cross was the one perfect sacrifice for us, and then rose from the dead as Jesus in the past, working for us today, covering all our sin. Jesus in the present in verse 24, as he continues to work on our sanctification. All of us who are in Jesus Christ now, we are being, sanctified, made separated and holy for God on a daily basis, our daily walk. And then in verse 28, Jesus in the future, and Jesus when we coming for us in the future, and when we will be transformed and we will be glorified. We'll be in these eternal bodies where we no longer will have the ability to sin, and it's going to be pretty awesome. And so read that, and then look at those verses in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that talk about the temple veil being torn. And we talked about the temple veil and how big it was and everything, but the significance there, just ponder that for a minute, the significance of tearing that veil that separated the presence of God from us, from sinful people. Even the priests were separated from the glory of God by this veil. But how Jesus has torn that veil, and now we have the ability to actually be in the presence of God. It's no longer just for one high priest once a year to make special atonement and sacrifices. No, the veil has been torn, and we now have access to the presence of God. It's an awesome, awesome thing to think about that. And then the last thing we want to look at is going to be in Mark chapter 13, those first two verses, 1 and 2, where Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. And what's interesting about this prediction is not only that it came true in AD 70, and as the Roman soldiers burned the temple, the fire became so hot that the gold and all the that was used to ornate and decorate and everything in the temple, it was so hot that all this gold melted in it, and it ran down like liquid in between all of the stones of the temple and everything. And so then the Roman soldiers actually tore the temple apart, stone by stone, to get a hold of this gold. And it fulfilled the prophecy, just like Jesus talked about there in Mark 13. And the most significant part of this, though, more than anything, is that there is no longer a temple, because there is no longer needed a temple, because Jesus accomplished all that work on the cross. We no longer need a high priest. We no longer need blood sacrifice. We have the one and only pure and true sacrifice that was needed once and for all. And now all of us, anyone who is willing to accept Jesus Christ, can come boldly into the presence of God now. There is no temple. There's no temple veil. It's access straight to the Father now through Jesus Christ and Him alone. So read these verses for this week. Think about them, meditate on them, and then just come prepared to discuss them on Sunday. and looking forward to it. I'll talk to you guys later. God bless.